Good day to Sir Shahril, Shafie, and to all my friends. I am Loh Jun Quan, metric number 262260. So we are from Group 4, and our group consists of 5 members. So today we are going to learn Chapter 5, the special types of documentary credits.
Hi, my name is San and my metric number is 261485, and now I will present about the revocable and irrevocable document credits. And here I will discuss about what is revocable and irrevocable documentary credit. First, revocable document credit is a document that the opening bank reserves the right to change or modify the credit at any time without the consent of beneficiary. And second, the irrevocable is a document that the opening bank has no right to change the term of credit without the consent of beneficiary. And here I will discuss about the reason why the buyer issue a revocable documentary credit. First reason is the trade deal between the parties does not contain strict payment term, and the second reason is one of the trade party reside in an unstable economic or political geography, and the third is the buyer lack the trade trust in the supplier and want to keep the option safe till the goods are shipped. And the last is the buyer feel the product price may change due to the market fluctuation. There was 4 types of revocable letter of credit. The first is revocable and transferable. The issued LC is revocable in nature and can be transferred to the other beneficiary. The credit transfer becomes highly unlikely as the revocability clause limits its functionality. And second is revocable and standby. The LC is revocable and comes with standby feature. A standby LC mitigates the losses due to unfavorable circumstances to the supplier. And the third type is the secured LC, which the issued LC is secured by collateral from the buyer. Lastly is the revocable unsecured LC. The issued LC does not come with any collateral cover from the buyer. Issuing bank consider the buyer creditworthiness. There was 6 stages of revocable letter of credit, which the first stage is the buyer agrees to buy the goods from the seller and agrees to pay through a letter of credit. The buyer asks the issuing bank to issue a letter of credit. For the second stage, the issuing bank issue the revocable letter of credit and send it to seller via the advising bank, and the seller accept it. And for the third stage, the seller manufacture and ship the good and prepare the shipping document. And for the fourth stage, the seller send the original document as per the term of the letter of credit to issuing bank. For the fifth stage, the issuing bank check the document, collect the payment from the buyer and give the document to the buyer. Furthermore, it make the payment to the seller by the advising bank. And the last stage, which the buyer get the good clearance from shipping line. In the conclusion, the stage at which the issuing bank can revoke and amend the revocable letter of credit in the stage 3, 4 and 5. Okay, for the advantage of revocable letter of credit, first is the first party, who is buyer, can amend or revoke the LC at any time without notifying the second party, who is seller. And the second advantage is buyer can approach and secure favorable trade deal with revocable LC with supplier lacking sales in international trades. And the third advantage is the issuing bank do not hold obligation to serve the revocable LC contract if the terms are not met. And the last is the supplier only motivation, which revocable or secured by collateral LC to mitigate the default risk. So for the disadvantage of revocable letter of credit, first is it comes with a risk of default or revocability at any time before the contract completion. Second, the supplier usually cannot transfer the revocable LC credit due to lack of acceptance in the market. Lastly, the supplier may face a risk of economic loss due to false term by the buyer.
Hi, I'm Gan Ching Hoi 263246, and now I want to describe and explain about what is the transferable letter of credit and back-to-back letter of credit. So now I want to describe what is transferable letter of credit. Transferable letter of credit is just one of the type of letter of credit, which is the bank that issue the letter of credit will guarantee the importer or the buyer will pay a certain payment to the seller or export, which they have already buy the things from the exported. So in this transferable letter of credit, it's allow and permit an initial beneficiary, which is the first beneficiary, to transfer some or part of the money that's stated on the letter of credit. They are due to another party, which is maybe the another beneficiary. So in this dealing that using the transferable letter of credit, the parties involved in a transferable letter of credit are the applicants, which is the buyer, the first beneficiary, which is the middleman, and then the second is the seller, which is the second beneficiary. So which means in using this transferable letter of credit, the first beneficiary has the right to instruct the bank to transfer some or all portion of the money to a second beneficiary, so that the second beneficiary has not the right to transfer and instruct the bank to transfer another beneficiary. So transferable letter of credit is often used in business deals. That's to ensure the payment will be paid to the supplier and manufacturer. So it's one of the alternative options to make an advance payment. So now here is an example of case that relating how using of the transferable letter of credit. So let's we assume a buyer or importer, they want to contract a business deal which is 45,000 cost of goods from a seller or exporter. So in this business dealing, the seller specifically wants the buyer to issue a transferable letter of credit before proceeding with the production. So they want the financial guarantee from a bank. So that's why a buyer needs to partner with a bank to get an approval to issue the 45,000 letter of credit. So to allowing the seller as a secondary beneficiary to transfer the money. So if the bank agrees with a 45,000 total transferable provision, then the original beneficiary can request the 45,000 payment from the bank directly to be transferred to the seller at the time of sales that required. So now what is back-to-back letter of credit? Back-to-back letter of credit is just one of the type of letter of credit that consists two letter of credit to be used at the same time together to finance a transaction, which provide the financial guarantee by a bank or other financial institution. So a back-to-back letter of credit usually used in a transaction that involving the middleman, which is the intermediary party between the buyer and seller. So back-to-back letter of credit is very important and preliminary to be used in international transaction platform. So back-to-back letter of credit essentially will substitute two issuing letter of credit by a buyer or the intermediary parties to help them to facilitate the trade between them, and which is from a Great Eastern, Far Eastern, from another country for another country, to help them to more easily verify one of the credit condition which can be believed or not So here is an example of a case that relating how back-to-back of letter of credit to be function and operate. So first, let's assume that there is a company A is located in US and it is a seller to sell heavy machinery. And there is a buyer from located in China that they want to purchase the heavy machinery from US. And there is a middleman, which is the intermediary parties, which is broker B that trading firms based on London. So we can know that in this situation, the company A want to sell the machinery to the company C in China, but they're scared and they're not much of confident to take the risk of default payment that may be occurred by the company C. So they want to use the broker B as a middleman to facilitate this international transaction business. So the back-to-back of letter of credit can be used in this transaction goes through from the company C issue letter of credit from its country banks to get an issue LC towards the broker B, and then the broker B also will use the letter of credit to its own well-known financial institution to issue the LC to the company A, which is located in US, so that the company A from the US can now ship the machinery to the company C, as all the transfer letter of credit have played their role importance to transfer the letter of credit and to get a financial guarantee to the company A, so that the transaction can be done and the credit risk can be avoided. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sivathashann Naidu, analytic Perumal Naidu, metric number 261649. Okay, I'm going to present about rate clause letter of credit. Okay, first is what is rate clause of credit? A rate clause letter of credit is a specific type of letter of credit in which the buyer can extend the facility of advance payment to the seller against a certain documentary requirement. So for example, the issuing bank will make an advance payment to the exporter, or known as the seller, before the seller ship the goods to the importer, or which is known as buyer. This is usually done to provide aid to the seller in the form of working capital, to purchase raw material, processing and packaging of goods, and many more. The advance payment is done against documentary requirement, which includes written undertaking and receipts. Okay, next we are going to see advantage of rate clause letter of credit. So the first advantage is interest-free unsecured working capital finance for the seller. So the seller, which is known as beneficiary, has ready access to the working capital. If the seller or beneficiary uses the traditional method to financing, he may face interest on the loan which he need to pay. By using this rate clause letter of credit, the seller or beneficiary can save the interest from the working capital. So the next second advantage is advantages to the buyer. When the seller or beneficiary cut the cost from the interest from the working capital, he will automatically pass the benefit to the buyer where the cost of the product will be low. This rate clause letter of credit give benefit for both buyers and sellers. Okay, next we are going to see the disadvantages of rate clause letter of credit. One of the disadvantages is beneficiary may not use the advance for right purpose. So the main purpose of rate clause letter of credit is to provide funding to the seller or beneficiary for his working capital needs. This way the seller can have enough finance to pay for raw material, production costs, labor and many more. Rate clause letter of credit also act as surety to the buyer that the order placed will be manufactured on time and without any hitches. However, there is a situation where the beneficiary will not use the advance payment for its right purpose. In many cases, it has happened that the seller used the money to pay off his past debt. This actually opposes the purpose of the rate clause letter of credit. The next disadvantage is risk of bad debt. In any loan borrowing, when the borrower is given an advance payment by the lender, there is always a risk that the borrower may simply take the money and run off. This is an intrinsic risk that a rate clause letter of credit carries. The mechanism of rate clause letter of credit is such that the issuing bank provides an advance to the seller or beneficiary on instruction of the buyer. After the seller fulfills his obligation, the buyer pays to the bank. If the seller doesn't oblige to the side of the promise, then the issuing bank will ask for the money if the advance from the buyer. This is why it's very important for the buyer to have trust in the seller, else this arrangement can actually affect the buyer. Finally, the last disadvantage of red clause letter of credit is interest fee and other expenses. The red clause letter of credit is quite an expensive tool. It carries a fixed fee which is higher than regular letter of credit. Also, the advance payment that issuing bank gives to the seller carries an interest rate. At the time of final payment, the buyer has to pay this interest rate plus the letter of credit amount. Furthermore, the issuing bank may ask for collateral from the buyer against this letter of credit. It will also check the buyer's credibility and past records. Okay, now we are going to see about the process of red clause letter of credit. So the first process is the applicant and beneficiary agree to enter the sales contract. The second process is applicant will ask issuing bank to create LC with specific terms. The third process is the red clause LC will be sent by issuing bank to the advising bank. The fourth process is the advising bank later verify the authenticity of the red clause of LC and forward it to the exporter. The fifth process is after receipt of the red clause LC, the exporter is expected to verify the same of their satisfaction and initiate the goods shipping process. The sixth process is after the goods are shipped, the exporter present the documents which is bill of exchange or draft to the advising bank. The seventh process is the document will be forwarded to the issuing bank by the advising bank. The next process is the issuing bank will provide fund to the advising bank. The ninth process is the advising bank will receive the fund from the issuing bank and forward it to the beneficiary. And the 10th process is the document received by the issuing bank will be sent to the applicant. The 11th process is the applicant will pay the amount as per agreed between the issuing bank. The 12th process is the proof of the delivery will be sent to the advising bank. The 30th process is advising bank will forward the documentation to the issuing bank. The 40th process is applicant need the documentation to receive the shipment of the good. And the last process is applicant will pay balance amount of money to the issuing bank. Thank you.
So now I'm going to continue the discussion with the green clause letter of credit. So in general, green clause letter of credit is similar to the red clause letter of credit as discussed earlier. But the green clause letter of credit is considered an extension of the red clause letter of credit, which means it provides the advance not only for the purchase of the raw material, processing, and the packaging of the goods, but also for the pre-shipment warehousing or the storage facilities at the expenses of the buyer. So this type of clause is typed and printed in the green ink. Therefore, we name it as the green clause letter of credit. So usually, the advance under this letter of credit is granted only after the purchased goods are stored in the bounded warehouses. So the green clause letter of credit usually used in the export of the agricultural commodities such as the wheat, rice, sugar, corn, soybean, and etc. So okay, now let's look at the differences between both types of letter of credits. So the differences between the red clause and the green clause letter of credits can be divided into several dimensions, where the first distinction is about the definition or the function of the letter of credit. So the red clause letter of credit provides the advance of payment for the working capital to purchase the raw material, processing, packaging of goods, and etc. However, in green clause letter of credit, it provides an additional advance for the pre-shipment warehousings at the port of origin. Second, in the red clause letter of credit, the advance will be given before the seller ships the good. However, in the green clause letter of credit, the advance will be given after the purchased goods are stored in the warehouse. So third, the differences between the green clause and the red clause of credit is about the documentary requirement. Well, the advance can be transferred in the red clause letter of credit by presenting the written undertaking and the receipt. However, an additional document of title is required in the green clause letter of credit for transfer of advance. Fourth, the proportion of the advance of the green clause letter of credit is more higher than the red clause letter of credit. So at the range between 75% to 80% of the face value of the letter of credit. So lastly, the importer is more secure in the green clause letter of credit than the red clause letter of credit. This is because the buyer is extending the advance against the document of the title, which means the buyer knows that the goods in question are already warehoused and only the shipment procedure is remaining. So on the other hand, the red clause letter of credit, the advance can be extended even before the production begins. So this makes it riskier for the buyer. So now comes to the counter's credit. So the term counter credit is usually referred to the cash deposit. So it's considered important to help the importer to buy, okay, or the buyer to apply for the letter of credit. So the counter credits creates an active cash flow and the historical background of the transaction of the applicants, and it provides a good merit for the applicants in applying the letter of credit. However, according to the business dictionary, in the international trade, the terms counter credit may refer to the back-to-back letter of credit, where the counter credit occur when a letter of credit is issued as collateral for another letter of credit. So it's usually used by the middleman who buy the goods from one customer and sell them to another, or with the involvement of the subcontractor. So in general, it helps the seller or the exporter to purchase the item or services from the subcontractors. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Chia Song Gim and my matrix number is 261918. Now I'm going to present the other types of LC that has been used commonly in international trade, which is Standby Letter of Credit (SBLC). First of all, I will explain the concept of the Standby Letter of Credit. Standby Letter of Credit refers to a legal instrument issued by a bank on behalf of its client, providing a guarantee of its commitment to pay the seller if the buyers default on the agreement. Besides that, SBLC is frequently used in international and domestic transactions where the parties to a contract do not know each other, and it attempts to hash out the risks associated with such a transaction. Some of the risks include bankruptcy and insufficient cash flow on the part of the buyer, which prevents them from making payments to the seller on time. In addition, SBLC serves as a safety net by assuring the seller that the bank will make payment for the goods or services delivered if the buyer fails to make the payment on time. In such a case, SBLC ensures that the required payments are made to the seller after fulfillment of the required obligation. Next, I will explain how the standby letter of credit works in international trade. The process of obtaining an SBLC is similar to a loan application process. The process starts when the buyer applies for an SBLC at a commercial bank. The bank will perform its due diligence on the buyers to assess its creditworthiness based on past credit history and the most recent credit report. If the buyer's creditworthiness is in question, the bank may require the buyer to provide and accept all the funds on deposit as collateral before approval. The level of collateral will depend on the risk involved, the strength of the business, and the amount secured by the SBLC. The buyer will also be required to furnish the bank with information about the seller, shipping document required for payments, the beneficiary's bank, and the period when the SBLC is valid. After review of the documentation, the commercial bank will provide an SBLC to the buyer. The bank will charge a service fee of 1% to 10% for each year when the financial instrument remains valid. If the buyer meets its obligation in the contract before the due date, the bank will terminate the SBLC without a further charge to the buyer. If the buyer fails to meet the terms of the contract due to various reasons, such as bankruptcy, cash flow crunch, dishonesty, and so on, the seller is required to present all the required documentation listed in the SBLC to the buyer's bank within a specific period. and the bank will make the payment due to the seller's bank. Moreover, I will explain the difference between the standby letter of credit (SPLC) and the letter of credit (LC). The first difference is the addition of special features. SPLC allows the buyer to impose some specific clauses to the agreement which a seller needs to fulfill. It can be about the number of goods or packaging requirements, whereas LC does not have any specific function that the buyer must follow in order to complete the transaction. The second difference is the requirement by issuing bank. SPLC impose obligation on banks, so banks require collateral in the form of security to issue SPLC. For the LC, the bank will verify the buyer's credibility and credit score in terms of ability to repay the loan before issuing a documentary letter of credit. So, the letter of credit are usually unsecured. The third difference is the purpose of issue. LC is a primary instrument of payment, so the goal is to use the letter of credit to complete the transaction. It provides security to the seller that the buyer will pay for the supply of goods. In contrast, SPLC is a secondary instrument of payment. If a seller is paid by a standby letter of credit, it means that something went wrong with the buyer. The goal, however, here remains for all the parties involved is to avoid using standby letter of payment. The next difference is the duration. SPLC is a long-term instrument with the validity of 1 year, while LC is a short-term instrument that usually expires within 90 days. The fifth difference is the area of use. SPLC is usually used to provide security in long-term construction projects and domestic transactions as well, whereas LC is the most commonly used trade financing instrument in sales agreements where the buyer is the importer and the seller is the exporter. The last difference is the issuing cost. The cost of issuing a regular SPLC is 1% to 10% of the amount covered. In contrast, the cost of issuing a regular LC is 0.75% to 1.5% of the amount covered. Furthermore, I will explain the types of the standby letter of credit. The first type of SPLC is financial SPLC. The financial SPLC guarantees the payment for goods or services as stipulated in the agreement. For instance, if a crude oil company ships oil to a foreign buyer with an expectation that the buyer will pay within 20 days from the date of shipment, and the payment is not made by the required date, the crude oil seller can collect the payment for goods delivered from the buyer's bank. Since it is a credit, the bank will collect the principal plus interest from the buyer. The second type of SPLC is performance SPLC. The performance SPLC guarantees the completion of a project within the scheduled timelines. If the bank's client is unable to complete the project outlined in the contract, then the bank promises to reimburse the third party to the contract a specific sum of money. The performance SPLC is used in projects that are scheduled for completion within a specific timeline, such as construction projects. The payment serves as a penalty for delays in the project's completion, and it is used to compensate the customer for the inconvenience caused or to pay another contractor to take over the project. In addition, I will explain the advantages of the standby letter of credit. The first advantage is that SPLC helps to ensure that the buyer will receive the goods or services listed in the document. For instance, if a contract calls for the construction of a building and the builder fails to deliver, the client presents the SPLC to the bank to be made whole. Another advantage when involved in global trade, a buyer has an increased certainty that the goods will be delivered from the seller. The second advantage is that if the companies provide SPLC, they can easily get rid of the worst case scenario. If an agreement calls for payment within 30 days of delivery and the payment is not met, the seller can present the SPLC to the buyer's bank for payment. Therefore, the seller is guaranteed to be paid. Another advantage for the seller is that the SPLC reduces the risk of the production order being changed or cancelled by the buyer. The third advantage is that if small business find it difficult to compete with larger and better known competitors, SPLC can add credibility to its bid for a project and can oftentimes help avoid an upfront payment to the seller.